Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Nutritional Revolution podcast. Today, you get to listen to just me. I'm going to be talking to you guys all about hydration. Today, this is going to be a two-part episode, actually, because it's a bit lengthy, the material we gathered for this. So today, we're going to be covering what is defined as being hydrated or being dehydrated, signs of dehydration, why it's important to maintain hydration in regards to sports performance, what things can affect our hydration status, and then how to track our sweat losses. And part 2 is going to get released next week, and we're going to be diving into all things proper hydration techniques, what to look for in a hydration product, maybe some products we suggest, and then we're going to cover some questions that we got from our audience. So we will dive right in. First things first, I want to define what is hydration and or dehydration. And so there's a couple terms that maybe many of you have heard, but one of them being hypo hydration. So that's HYPO hydration. And that actually means low body water. And then we have hyper hydration, HYPER hydration. And that is a high body water. And then we have a term, of course, many of you have heard, dehydration. And that's actually defined as the process of losing body water, but much literature will also describe it as a state of low body water as well. So similar to the definition for hypohydrated. And then we have something called euhydrated. That's EU hydrated. And that means optimal body water content. So optimally hydrated intracellularly and extracellularly, that fluid balance is maintained. So we might be using those a bit today, but primary thing you guys have probably heard of is dehydration, again, which could also be coined as hypohydration potentially. And then in our part 2, we're going to talk about ways to hyperhydrate leading up to events and when that's necessary. So some of the things too we want to cover. What is in our sweat, or what are we losing when we sweat? And of course, many of you know water is definitely the primary component of that. Our body is composed of 60 to 70% water. So that main thing that we're losing for sure is going to be good old H2O or water. And then the primary electrolytes we're going to see there are sodium, and that comes typically with chloride. Sodium chloride molecules are being lost. Then we have potassium and we have magnesium. And then I think one that many people don't realize that we're losing is actually we lose a little bit of iron in our sweat. So something to be mindful for those endurance athletes. Keeping tabs on their ferritin and iron levels is important for performance. So those are going to be the things that are trying to maintain some balance. They're also involved in like muscle contraction. So that can be one of the things we're going to dive into as a possible sign of dehydration. If we're losing some of these electrolytes, losing some of that fluid within our muscle cells, it can affect the signaling and contraction of the muscle cells and potentially causing cramping. But first things first, what are normal sweat ranges? And so we've done tons of testing with our athletes, and we've seen firsthand the large range of sweat losses in the population. And I will say that there is not a men's specific sweat rate versus a female specific sweat rate. It is all over the board. There can be some kind of alignment in the sense of level of fitness in one's sweat losses. So definitely the more trained and fit we become, the more efficient our system becomes at sweating sooner to cool us. So that is something that could be seen. But typical ranges will be 1 to 2 liters lost per hour is kind of the most common area. Can go all the way up as to 3 or even 4 liters per hour. However, that is typically only seen in 2% of athletes. So definitely less so, but we can be losing quite a significant amount of water. And for those of you who prefer this in ounces, that would be 1 to 2 liters per hour is equivalent to 33 to 67 ounces per hour. And if we're losing 3 to 4 liters per hour, we're looking at 101 to 135 ounces per hour. So those numbers are pretty large if you think about it. And even the high end of the 1 to 2 liters per hour, someone losing 67 ounces per hour, I know you're not drinking that much per hour to minimize or definitely equate those losses, right? So something to think about and why it's really important if the majority of the population is in this 1 to 2 liter per hour range, and that's 33 to 67 ounces per hour, you span that over, I mean, it could be a 12-hour Ironman, it could be, I had clients do 24-hour ultras. Like if you're continuing to lose 67 ounces per hour over 24 hours, how do you minimize those losses? How do you come into that situation pre-hydrated to have more water on board in your system to spare those losses? Similarly to how we would carb load, we want to get as much carbohydrates in our system to have stores to pull from for the race and delay that depletion. We can do a similar thing with water and fluids and electrolytes. We can hyperhydrate and preload. And that's something we'll talk about in part 2. So those are total or common ranges for fluid loss. And then I also want to differentiate that fluid loss is just one piece of the puzzle. Sodium concentration within your fluid is a whole other piece of the puzzle. So many people can easily get information on their fluid loss, and we'll talk about ways to do that in today's episode. But most people do not know the actual sodium concentration within their sweat. And this is another thing we've tested with hundreds of athletes. And it is, again, something that is all over the board. So again, it's not specific to menstruating women are losing this concentration of sodium in their sweat, and like older men are losing this. It is not unique to gender. It is all over the board. And so with that, a typical sweat sodium concentration loss, and I'll convert these for you guys, but straight from the literature, they're calling it 10 to 90 millimoles per liter. Majority population sitting between 30 to 50 millimoles per liter. So for us that need to do some organic chemistry conversion, molar mass of sodium is 22.9 grams per mole. So we're looking at, for that, the bigger range, we're looking at 62 to 620 milligrams of sodium per liter, or kind of the more majority is looking at 186 to 310 milligrams per liter. So again, majority population, 186 to 310 milligrams per liter. So we're looking back at our sweat loss, which was a common range of 1 to 2 liters per hour, or 33 to 67 ounces per hour. Of that sweat lost, you're more than likely losing somewhere between 186 to 310 milligrams of sodium in that sweat, majority population. But again, if we jump up to that high end, 3 to 4 liters per hour, or up to 135 ounces lost per hour, and we're looking at sodium loss concentrations, does that in that situation would mean that person, they're losing a high amount of fluids, but the sodium within their fluids is not nearly as concentrated as the person who's losing 1 liter per hour. So something to consider. There is some genetics to this. There's some training to this. So definitely as you get more fit, and again, you are becoming more efficient at cooling yourselves, there is a little bit of improvement in sweat sodium concentration. So an example would be sauna protocol. So many times athletes will do sauna exposure sessions leading up to doing some training, maybe in high heat, humidity, or altitude. And doing this will actually start to train your system, because the body is very smart, that it can almost in a sense spare sodium losses. So if you were to test potentially sodium concentration in the beginning of the season, maybe you're coming off of a winter break, or your rest period of time, your sweat sodium concentration might be higher because your fitness has gone down a little bit. Your system's not used to maybe higher temps, maybe it's, cooler weather. And then if you were to test sodium concentration by end of summer, after you've had consistent exposure, maybe you did some sauna protocol, I would imagine that your sodium concentration within your sweat would be a little bit less. So something to consider there. And again, reasons why we'll want to test individually, and we'll dive into those as well. So the other thing I want to cover with you guys is signs of dehydration. And there's some things in here that maybe people don't realize, and a few things I've had to break down to some of our clients too, just because I don't think people realize that. But common things, feeling thirsty, of course. Typically that means you're probably a little too far, not too far gone, but by the time you've gotten the signal to drink, the dehydration is happening. So trying to stay ahead of that can be important. If you're feeling dizzy, lightheaded, getting some fatigue, loss of focus, if you're feeling dry mouth, lips, and eyes. Of course, if you're using the restroom and you notice very dark urine, that's also a sign. Headaches, muscle cramping, if you're feeling irritable. And this is the one that I think many people don't realize, is that if you are not properly hydrated or you're becoming more and more dehydrated, you will see an elevation in your heart rate. And I'll dive into a little bit as to why that is, but I think most people don't realize that. So I've had, just in training sessions, clients tell me that they're trying to hit their normal pace, but their heart rate was way higher. And then we find out that they went into the session dehydrated and then continued to progressively get more dehydrated. And of course, that makes your heart work harder. We'll walk through all of that here. And then worst thing, you notice you stop sweating. That is definitely a sign that your system's out of fluids, obviously, to help continue to cool you. So that's the next piece we're going to dive into. And the importance of hydration in sport is really coming down to managing your body's core temperature is really the primary reason. And our systems can tolerate cooler temperature drops pretty well, but our systems are not as great at the equivalent of increasing temps. So thermoregulation, or maintaining that core temperature, is critical to our survival and preventing overheating or heat stroke or things like that. So I'm going to kind of walk through what's going on when the body's trying to sweat or cool us. So as we're exercising, our working muscles are contracting, and that is a way that heat is produced within the body. And this increased body heat it's a gained heat. And then if you think about if we're outside and then there is sun exposure, or the air temperature is greater than our skin temperature, then there's going to be heat transfer from the air to our body. So we're going to absorb heat that way and get a further increased core temperature. So as the body temperature increases, the central and skin thermoreceptors, the little sensors, will take this information and they're going to send it to what we call the preoptic hypothalamic region of our brain. And it's going to tell the body to start sweating and cause something called cutaneous vasodilation to get rid of our heat. So cutaneous vasodilation is going to be opening up of those blood vessels in the areas that are kind of closest to the surface of the skin, the most efficient ways to off heat. So think about your hands, your feet, forearms, maybe neck, head. The body's going to open up the blood vessels there so it can really direct the blood flow there, push water to the surface of the skin, and create heat. So the biggest thing is the way we will off heat is evaporative heat loss is the primary way we're going to off heat during exercise. So if we think about training in a breezy situation, maybe outside versus an indoor trainer where there is no fans going, that the ability to feel cooler is going to be a very different, right? And you're also going to notice sweat likely piling up more so in the trainer session inside. And it's not that you're sweating more inside, it's that it is more noticeable, so long as it's the same, if we think about two exact same temperatures. So when we have that breeze, it is feeling cooler as it's taking heat off of the body. So our heat is transferred from our body in the form of water to the surface of our skin as sweat. And then this water turns into water vapor, and this removes the heat from the body. So that's how we cool ourselves. And long story short, that's why we're sweating. And what is a very interesting area of research that I just want to mention here is, for years and years, gold standard of research, I'll preface this, is doing a study where there's blinding involved, meaning that the participants don't know that they're getting the treatment option or the non-treatment option. When we are doing hydration studies, it's very hard to blind somebody, meaning how can you have an athlete who's on a trainer bike in a lab and then test them for like consuming fluids versus not consuming fluids and their performance and have them not know that they're getting fluids? It's a little tricky. So with that being said, there was some research that was coming out wondering if just the thought that knowing they're getting fluids, and because they can't blind somebody from drinking fluids in prior studies, at least this was the case, that knowing that dehydration was quote unquote bad, that the individuals who are not getting the fluids in the group would then perform in a less optimal way. However, we now have the ability to blind, and that's actually by putting a nasogastric tube into the athlete's nose while they're on the trainer. I know it sounds very joyful experience, right? In through the nose, and it's in the stomach, and they're actually in control of whether they're putting, and actually there was an IV study done as well where they directed fluids into the arm via IV. So the athletes didn't know whether they were getting fluids or not. And what they did see is it in fact fell in line with the prior research in that dehydration that exceeded 2% of body mass did in fact impair these cyclists' performance in the heat. So being able to blind them was a good way to kind of help further the prior research results and enforce that. So very interesting there. So some of the reasons, again, why it's very important to maintain our hydration. We mentioned this thermoregulation, controlling that core temperature, and some other things that can occur, these cascade effects, being some decreased plasma volume. So as we become dehydrated, the fluid amount in our blood plasma decreases. And this is one of the primary drivers for a decline in performance. So as that blood loses fluid, we of course have a harder time cooling ourselves. We can have a harder time delivering oxygen and nutrients to the working muscle tissue. We do see reduced stroke volume and cardiac output, reduced muscle and cerebral blood flow too, when that's the case, increased body temperature, as I mentioned. And interestingly, increased glycogen use. So the carbohydrates that are stored within your muscle, we see an increased utilization of those and pulling those out of your system, the more dehydrated you become. And then of course, increased perceived exertion. So your heart rate is going up, you're becoming dehydrated, efforts are feeling harder, thus you're using more glycogen or carbohydrates in your from your system. And then that perceived exertion is going to feel harder. So a study example here we had by Dion et al. In 2013, the researchers demonstrated that running speed was positively correlated with sweat rate, but not drinking rate. So as speed increased, dehydration increased. So I think probably many of you are like, duh, you know that firsthand, right? The harder the intensity that you're doing your training sessions at, the less inclined you are to drink. And that's not uncommon. And of course, that's just going to further that dehydration risk, right? We're drinking less, we're working harder, so we're sweating more, we're just creating a larger gap there. So again, probably obvious for most of you guys. And then the other piece of this would be in regards to endurance athletes. Many, even when starting exercise hydrated, finish in a dehydrated state. So something to be mindful of there. I think I had seen in a previous paper too, that a good majority of people actually start exercise and even races dehydrated unknowingly. So starting your race or training session hydrated can make a big difference, because of course you're going to continue to become dehydrated. Most people are not consuming 63 ounces or 67 ounces per hour to match that loss, unless you've done a whole lot of gut training, which is something we'll talk about in part 2. So some things that can affect our hydration requirements. And so this is a very interesting area that I think some people are starting to catch on to, is that once we calculate your fluid losses and your sweat sodium concentration, that's great information. But what's important is that your fluid losses are going to change in different environments, and to know that. So you can't consistently say, okay, this race in Coeur d'Alene, I consumed 1.5 bottles per hour. I'm going to stick with that when I go to Kona. It's not going to work more than likely. Your fluid losses in Kona, warmer, more humid, probably going to be significantly greater. So being able to understand and know what your fluid losses are going to be in different environmental conditions is critical. So, of course, things that can affect our hydration requirements, temperature. We did actually just release a podcast episode. By the time you hear this, maybe it would be last week or 2 weeks ago, with Dr. Julian Perriard out of the University of Canberra, and his research is solely focused on thermoregulation and sweat losses. So super interesting episode. I suggest you guys go listen to that. And altitude can play a factor. So typically the higher we go up in elevation, the less water molecules there are in the air, which makes it a little bit drier environment. And if the drier environment is drier than like our respirations coming up, like as we breathe out, it's going to pull the moisture basically out of us and quickly off the surface of our skin into the air because it is a drier environment. So that can affect our sweat rates and our, humidity. So the more moisture in the air, the opposite kind of situation. If you think about Kona, is a good example, very high humidity, kind of rainforest environment, a lot of moisture in the air. This will affect sweat rates in a way where, because there's so much moisture in the air, that evaporative, that primary way we want to cool ourselves, the evaporative cooling, is not as effective, because as you sweat and that sweat piles up on the surface of your skin, there's already so much moisture in the air that there is not an inclination for the water on the surface of your skin as sweat to be pulled into the air and get that evaporative effect. So many times we're not feeling as cool in a humid environment, so high moisture content in the air. And then radiant heat can affect our hydration requirements. Of course, our pace or our effort, our fitness level, as I mentioned. So more fit, we tend to sweat sooner, but we can be a little bit more efficient in our sweat sodium concentrations. And then your degree of heat acclimation. So is it, your first training session of spring or summer, and it's your first kind of hot day outside, that might feel a bit more challenging. You might have a harder time cooling core temperature, things like that. Whereas towards the end of the summer, your last summer ride, after you've had multiple exposures to the heat, your sweat and core temperature control will be different. Of course, the clothing you wear can play a factor. Are you wearing long sleeves, windbreakers, a sweatsuit? Those will all, of course, affect your sweat rates. And actually, speaking of clothing, that can be one of the ways you can get some heat acclimation exposure. If you, for example, I had a client, he was located up in, I think it was Vermont, and his ability to get and train in warm environments was slim to none. So doing training sessions inside with the heater, no fan, layered up in sweats, you name it, those are ways we can simulate without actually getting, getting him to Kona or something like that to get true experience can help. And then, of course, final thing being genetics. And I'm sure many of you have kind of maybe pondered this thought, and it is not a wrong one. So we have 3 types of sweat glands across our body. We have apocrine, apoecrine, and ecrine or ecrine, depending on how you pronounce it. And the primary one for thermoregulation is going to be that ecrine sweat glands. And the reason being is they're located across the majority of the body. And humans will have 2 to 3 million ecrine sweat glands. The differences exist in sweat secretion rate from our sweat glands rather than the sweat gland density. And I believe I was reading in this paper that your sweat gland amount, so that 2 to 3 million range, is set very early in age. So I want to say it was, infancy, your sweat gland density is determined. And then, of course, we continue to grow, and it doesn't mean we get more sweat glands. It's just those sweat glands obviously grow with our body, right? So that I thought was very interesting. So our rate of sweat secretion per gland is what's going to be the difference, not the amount of necessarily the density. And then something many people may not know is that actually as we sweat, our sodium and chloride molecules are actually reabsorbed. So you're sweating, your body's pushing them out, these sweat glands, and we have these at the luminal membrane, sodium is actively reabsorbed via what's called sodium potassium ATPase transporters, and it will pull a little bit back in. And what it does with that fluid is it takes it from an isotonic concentration. So it's very similar to our blood plasma volume as it kind of pushes the fluids out with the electrolytes in it to a hypotonic final sweat concentration on the surface of the skin, interestingly enough. So it doesn't necessarily mean, you don't need as much sodium, but what's cool is your body's really smart and it will pull some sodium back in. But we still likely in certain situations will need to include some electrolytes in our fluids, depending on the duration. And then the final thing I'm going to cover here with you guys is how to track our sweat losses. So the simplest and most accurate method to assess our changes is ideally in nude mass, pre and post exercise. And this is not acceptable for every situation, but if you can, with as little clothing on as possible, weigh yourself before you do a training session and then weigh yourself immediately after that training session. It could be any length of session. It could be a high intensity session. It could be a run. It could be a trainer ride. It could be an outdoor bike. Any of those are fine. However, the longer it is, I imagine you're going to be drinking some fluids, maybe eating some food, maybe stopping to use in the bathroom. If that's the case, those are things you want to account for. So you do want to account, if you want to be super nitty gritty with it, you literally do want to weigh your foods on a food scale as an option. You do want to account for fluids consumed, and you want to account for bathroom stops. And the big thing is if you are not able to weigh fully nude, the sweat trapped in your clothing post weigh-in is going to be a factor absolutely in your results, because that's going to make you weigh more and read as a lesser sweat loss in your results. So something to consider there. And I will actually mention a study where they looked at weighing nude versus not and the percentage of underestimation. So in a study using weight pre and post without being nude, they tested women wearing a racing singlet, shorts, socks, and discovered there was an 8 to 10% underestimation of sweat losses. Okay. So they're underestimating fluid losses because they were weighing in slightly heavier than they would have if they were nude because of the sweat trapped in their racing singlet and shorts. And then urine losses when unaccounted for, caused an overestimation of sweat losses by 16 to 37%. And that range is dependent on the temperature conditions. So they tested these women in what they called a cool environment and a warm environment. And so that was kind of the range we saw there. And that was a study by Baker et al. In 2017. We'll cite these references in the show notes if you guys want to check this stuff out. So that is kind of the simplest way to test your fluid losses and see how that's varying. And then the other thing I will mention, and kind of we touched a little bit on in the beginning here, is that this test, weighing yourself pre and post, is truly just looking at that sweat rate, the fluid loss. It is not accounting for any sort of sodium concentration, of course. That's another big piece of determining how much sodium you need in your bottles or, across your hour of race or training. And so I do think that's something that's important to figure out if you have the ability. Definitely the gold standard, which many of us will not have access to, but is for sweat sodium concentration testing, is something called a whole body washdown method. And that is done in a scientific lab. So I know we won't have access. Most of us won't have access to that. So the next best options would be something like Gatorade has come out with a sweat patch. And that is something that actually they did clinical testing on to compare it to the whole body washdown method, and the results were spot on enough for them to come out with a patch. We have used this with a lot of our athletes. I will say that there can be some user error for sure. And the app itself is not super user friendly. So make sure you download that, get yourself familiar with it before. However, the technology, when it works, it's great. Like, it has been spot on with these other testing methods that I'm going to mention next, which is cool. So, and it's pretty reasonably affordable. And we are not sponsored by any of these people, by the way. The next option would be something called, it's Precision Hydration, excuse me, it's a sweat testing company. And they have a device that I think it's purchased by businesses, essentially, can use their machine to test sweat testing. So difference here is with the Gatorade sweat patch, you're wearing that in the condition of training. Whereas with the precision testing, you are going into a room, sitting down in your regular street clothes, and they put a chemical solution on your arm, which stimulates sweating. And then the machine picks up the sweat losses or sweat sodium concentration as well. And they give you, I believe, a milligram per liter recommendation. The next method would be something called level-in sweat testing. They've been around for a long time. They actually send you, it's a similar absorbent patch situation. You would wear that during your session as well, and they take it into the clinical lab and test it. So in terms of likely accuracy, I would probably go level-in sweat testing first, potentially. And then, it's kind of a tie-off between probably Gatorade and Precision, depending on what your budget is. Gatorade patches are $25. I think Precision testing is like $300. So, and if they're near you. Level-in, I don't have the price off the top of my head. And the final thing I'll kind of say about this too is there's an interindividuality on the day-to-day. So as I mentioned, in regards to fluid losses, there can be interindividuality when it comes to sweat sodium concentration. If I mentioned someone doing sauna training, they can train their body to be more efficient with the sodium losses within their sweat by getting continued exposure to the heat. So your body, for example, I'm going to give really extreme numbers, but say you're losing 1 liter per hour, and it's 1,000 milligrams of sodium that you're losing in that liter per hour. As you get more and more fit and you get more sauna exposure, more heat exposure, you're likely going to increase your fluid losses above 1 liter per hour. However, your body is smart and it doesn't want to just dump out all that sodium with an increased fluid loss. So again, your body has those tactics to reabsorb some sodium, and it can also put out less sodium. So you may push your fluid losses up. So maybe now you're losing 1.5 liters per hour, but maybe your sodium concentration now is still 1,000 milligrams per 1.5 liters. So whatever that math comes to, just as an example, that can change. So from the research, we say that there's individuality on the day-to-day, even with the whole body washdown method, that can vary by 5 to 7% just on the day-to-day. And then with the absorbent patch techniques, that can vary 5 to 16%. And we have seen with our female athletes that their sodium concentration within their sweat seems to vary with phase of menstrual cycle for our menstruating females. So something to consider if you are doing sweat sodium testing with one of those absorbent patch methods, to try it in your low hormone phase. So in the first 2 weeks after bleeding, or in your high hormone phase, the luteal phase. So the last 2 weeks of your cycle before bleeding. So something to consider there. Play around with it, see what kind of information you get. It can be, again, incredibly helpful. We find it something that has been really useful for our athletes to fine tune, because there really is no one perfect hydration suggestion across the board. So I highly encourage doing self-testing, or if you guys need help with any of that, that is what we do with our one of the many things we do with our athletes, dialing them in for different races and different conditions. We're always evolving that stuff. So as a kind of in summary here, we covered what is defined as hydration, signs of dehydration, why it's important to maintain hydration in our sports, and things that will affect our hydration requirements, and of course, how to track our sweat and sodium losses. And then as a reminder, we are doing a part 2 that will be released next week, and we're covering proper hydration techniques, what to look for in a hydration product, some products we suggest, and we're going to be covering some good questions from our audience. So you guys will learn, does coffee dehydrate you? What kind of solution, carbohydrate concentration are we looking for in electrolyte? Maybe different types of sugars that might be better than others in an electrolyte, etc. So hope to see you guys on that one. Kristen will be with me, so it won't be me just blabbing by myself. All right, you guys enjoy and happy sweat testing.